Okay, welcome everyone. It's Friday afternoon, East Coast time at least. Thank you all for joining HuffPost today. I'm Hillary Fry, I'm the executive editor, and I'm so excited to be here today with our Washington Bureau Chief, Amanda Turkle, our senior White House correspondent, Shirish Date, and our senior politics reporter, Kevin Rovelard, to talk to you about everything that's happening, what's going to happen, what might happen. I mean, and just what's going on right at this minute. Obviously, we're waiting for news. As if you're here, I'm sure you're aware. So if news breaks about who the next president-elect is, we will probably have to say goodbye to go do our jobs as journalists. So, some of us will stick around to wrap things up, but just wanted to highlight that here. We've got our eyes and ears open and are eagerly awaiting that. But in the meantime, we'll talk about where we're at. Before we get to the conversation, I really wanted to thank you all and members of our HuffPost staff for making the time to do this today. Especially given the week that it's been. And I wanted to say to all of you all who love HuffPost also that as the executive editor, I'm incredibly proud of our coverage of Trump's campaign of the last 4 years and obviously of this week. So just thank you to you all. A couple of guidelines before we get started here. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you're comfortable, please turn on your video so we can see you. You can find that feature at the bottom left of your screen. We also want to hear from you. I'm sure you've got lots of questions about what's happened and what's going to happen next. So when we get to the Q&A portion in about a half an hour, you can raise your hand to ask a question of our panel. And that's a virtual hand. It's part of Zoom. So you can do that by clicking on participants at the bottom of your screen, and then you'll see a panel open up on the right with the raise hand option. So you can click that and I will call on people in order as hands are raised with questions. If you're on a mobile device, click the More button at the bottom right and select Raise Hand. We'll do our best to get to your question. And when it's your turn, I will call you up, say your name, ask you to share where you're from, and go ahead and ask your question. Oh, sorry, there's a little noise there. Okay, and just last thing, we love that you're all HuffPost members. If you're here, you're a basic member. But if you're not already, please consider becoming a paid member to HuffPost. If you love our journalism, this really makes a huge difference in our support. So feel free to show us how much you love us by becoming a paid member of HuffPost. Lizelle will put a link in the chat now here in Zoom so that you can upgrade your membership during this event. So now I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, Kevin, and Shirish for our conversation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for being here. It's nice to see a lot of you again. Yeah, so we are waiting for the news, like all of you are. And as Hillary said, if it happens, we are unfortunately going to have to jump off and deal with it. But we wanted to, I'm sure you are all following cable news, obsessively watching what's going on in each individual county. If you have questions about that, you can ask us, but I wanted to sort of step back, talk a little bigger picture, maybe some stuff that you aren't seeing on cable news all the time. And we hope you've been following along with HuffPost coverage as well. But first, as always, for those of you who have been here before and know about this, we have some polls that we like to have you guys do. So we are going to pull up the first poll now. And it is just a question about how late did you stay up on election night? Before midnight? Did you go to sleep by 2 a.m., 3 a.m., or have you just not slept yet? Which I would totally believe too. So I wanted to start off with Kevin and Shirish. I will start off with Kevin first because it looks like Shirish is walking somewhere. Kevin, what were we obviously still don't know. It looks like that Biden is going to be declared the winner at any time, although we're still waiting for that. But in general, what were the biggest surprises for you from the election?
I mean, I think the overall big surprise, and what, if we want to go back and start litigating this, the polls did not pick up, was just how much Republican turnout Donald Trump would drive. We knew that it was going to be a lot. What happened in a lot of these races and places is that he drew even more than we expected. And I think we could also say that Trump's gains with some groups of Hispanic and Latino voters were much larger than we expected. And if you want to point to an individual race, Susan Collins surviving in Maine, ultimately by the margin she did, more so than the simple fact that she survived, was quite surprising. But I think other than that, a lot of this went some of the ways we were expecting. Joe Biden made very big gains in the suburbs. He was able to turn out a higher number of Democrats in many of these places than Hillary Clinton did. And Joe Biden made the small but crucial gains among the white working class voters we've spent so much time talking about over the past 4 years in order to flip Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That was sort of the game plan from the beginning, and that's the game plan he ended up executing. And then sort of increased black turnout in Georgia, along with gaining in the suburbs there. Looks like it's going to flip Georgia. Similar dynamic is happening in Arizona with Latino voters there instead of black voters. So much of this went down the way we predicted. The bigger surprises really came from higher Republican turnout and how that sort of trickled down ballot and hurt some House Democrats in particular, and sort of denied Senate Democrats the chance to win the Senate, at least for now, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Sharish? You are muted, Sharish.
Okay, is that better? Yeah, well, there was this loud fire emergency alarm going off, so I had to deal with that. It is a test, so all good. What was the question? About the.
So what were the biggest surprises for you from election night?
Honestly, the biggest surprise for me was, the state where I lived for 20 years came in so big for Donald Trump very early in the evening, and it wasn't for the reasons that I thought. It was in Miami-Dade County, where the Cuban American vote went heavily for Donald Trump. That was incredible. I mean, just the volume of the vote. I was not anticipating that. I knew he had made inroads, but I did not realize that he'd made that kind of inroads and actually turned down not just Cuban Americans, but also Venezuelan Americans, Colombian Americans. And, they've been working on that for years. And that is a place where the socialism message actually works, unlike the suburbs of Philadelphia, Atlanta, et cetera. So that was my only really big surprise. I was surprised by Georgia. I thought that it would revert to form. And even if Vice President Biden ends up losing that state, it's still kind of amazing to me that it's basically going to be 50-50. That's stunning. Arizona, I was not surprised by. I spent some time out there in the last couple of years reporting, and the Democrats and actually progressive groups have done an amazing job getting the Latino community out there organized and engaged and actually voting. We saw that in the 2018 midterms, where they picked up a whole bunch of seats in the state legislature, and we saw it again, obviously, on Tuesday. So, the Trump folks are obviously displeased about how things went in the upper Midwest, but they should have seen that coming. I mean, the economy has not been great up there. Hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs were lost because of the president's trade war. They should have seen that coming.
And so why were the polls? I mean, we're still figuring out what exactly happened with the polls, but why did the polls seem to so underestimate Republican turnout and the effect that Trump would have?
Well, go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, sure. I think it's ultimately that voters in rural areas broadly, and I think this is true of Republicans and Democrats in rural areas, aren't picking up the phone. You hear a lot about like shy Trump voters. That's not really what this is. When these people pick up the phone, they're more than willing to tell a pollster they support Trump. It's more of a matter of who these pollsters are actually able to get on the phone. I was talking to one source who, I have to leave the state anonymous for now to protect this person, but basically said throughout their entire campaign, they've been able to get good samples of what the vote would be like in the major metro area of their state. So that's the city and the suburbs. But if you extend outward into that, into the rural areas, it's been really hard to get enough people on the phone. And that wasn't just sort of white working class people. This state has a decent population of rural Black people that were also really difficult to get on the phone. And that, I think, is going to be a really big problem for polling going forward, is how do they compensate for that? Because even the people who, might now claim they got it right, people like Trafalgar Group, which didn't actually get it right. They were, in many cases, just as off as sort of the more mainstream pollsters. Their methods aren't what's going to solve this problem either. And frankly, look, if we can't trust polling, that's a really, really big problem in this country. We need that to measure public sentiment, not just to predict elections. And as America gets sorted more and more into bubbles, which is a trend that's been going on for 20 years now, we sort of need public surveys to cut through those bubbles and see what people actually think. And if we can't trust those surveys, it's problematic in a lot of ways, not just for the purposes of predicting elections.
I think that the president's remarks about polling and how and boasting about shy Trump voters and essentially encouraging his supporters not to answer the phone and not to participate had some effect. Probably not as much as he would like to think, but I could see it. I could see some small percentage of his people saying, yeah, I'll mess with this. I won't answer, or I will answer wrong, or I will make stuff up. And, possibly if polling, political polling is not the end all of polling, right? So it's polling on other things, consumer sentiment and so forth. Is that wrong? I'm not sure that is. I think it's just this. And I think maybe that's a function, maybe right now, of who the president is. And, people don't want to admit that they're racist. That's not a thing that to anybody, whether they're talking to a pollster or to their neighbors. And so, and there's a phrase for it, I'm sure Ariel would know it if I could ask her, but that's certainly a factor here, since the president, frankly, ran the most openly racist campaign since George Wallace in 1968. That probably won't happen again, at least, well, we'll see. But I think it won't happen again in the next cycle. So maybe things will be a little bit more back to normal.
I want to read the poll results, which are done. What time did you go to bed on election night? 53% of you said before midnight. I'm very impressed with that. 25% by 2 a.m., 19% of you by 3 a.m., and then 2 of you said that you never slept at all. Interesting. I hope by now you've slept. So let's see, let's pull up another poll while we're at it. The next poll is going to be, I forgot what it's about, so it'll be a surprise when it comes up for everyone. Yes. Who will control the Senate in 2021 after the Georgia runoffs? The runoffs happen in January. And this is a good transition, actually, because I would like to talk more about the Senate. Because as Kevin was saying, the down ballot results, I think, were pretty surprising. Democrats had high hopes for retaking the Senate, or at least doing significantly better, especially in races like Maine, North Carolina. I mean, there were, so much. I think like Kentucky was always a long shot, but Democrats did pour a lot of money in there, South Carolina and other races. So, Kevin, we've talked a little bit about, obviously Trump's coattails were a little stronger than expected, but why else did Democrats do so poorly in a lot of these Senate races?
I mean, in a lot of these places, and I wrote a story about this that ran on election day, Democrats just are fighting far too uphill a battle. They've assembled a coalition that is, in the terms of political science terms, electorally inefficient. It's far too suburban and far too urban and not rural enough. That's really the core of it. There's a lot of rural states that are overrepresented in the Senate. Actually, I should be more clear. It's that urban states are underrepresented in the Senate. The problem isn't really that Wyoming has 2 senators. It's that California only has 2, because Wyoming is evened out by Delaware, is sort of how that ends up working out. So that's really the problem there. And that is a really tough problem for Democrats to solve, particularly as ticket splitting becomes less and less common. Right now, the number of Senate candidates who ran truly substantially ahead of the president, their presidential tickets, are basically Steve Bullock in Montana, Susan Collins in Maine, and then John Cornyn in Texas. That's only 3 of 30 senators running. That's not a lot. This is a really, really big problem for Democrats long term. They need to come up with a way to do better in these rural states, or they're never going to be able to get control of the Senate. And if you can't control the Senate, you have no control over the federal judiciary. This really, Democrats thought, was going to be their best chance for a while to take the Senate. 2022, with Biden in office, the map is slightly better for Democrats in 2022. There's actually a lot of pickle opportunities. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina are the 3 that immediately come to mind. But traditionally, Democrats, or the party in power, the president's party, doesn't do well in midterms. And then in 2024, it goes back to the worst map of the 3 Senate maps for Democrats, which has a lot of red-leaning states with Democratic senators that are very conservative. And that's like, can Joe Manchin win re-election in a presidential year? That's a lot different from Joe Manchin winning re-election in 2018, which was a Democratic wave year. Same with John Tester in Montana. This is really the biggest problem for Democrats. And look, Democrats made really good efforts in some of these places. Kansas and Montana, I think, are really going to be places where some of the strategies they employed, I think, will still be looked at. But in a lot of those places, the Republican turnout was just way, way too high. I think there's a few other races that are just real flops. Jamie Harrison in South Carolina ended up barely doing better after raising $100 million than a candidate who had run against Lindsey Graham 6 years ago, who only raised $500,000. I think that really indicates that cracking the South is still really, really difficult for Democrats to do. The politics there are so racially polarized. It's not simple, and you can't run these nationalized campaigns. But I don't know that a localized campaign works either, because I'm not sure a localized campaign cuts through the noise anymore. But this is undoubtedly the single biggest problem facing the Democratic Party right now, is their inability to win the Senate.
So, Sharice, did you want to go?
Well, I know that in Wisconsin, for example, the Democratic Party worked really hard to bring in rural areas. And again, I was impressed that it seemed to succeed. Biden was able to cut margins of how badly he did. And that's really, you don't have to win a community. You just have to shave off 3 or 4 or 5 or 6% off of how badly you do. And that makes a big difference. I saw that in Florida. He did pretty well in rural areas in Florida. So it's possible. They're just, and a lot of this is cultural. Not the South, the old Confederacy exists in a certain geographic place, but people who think like that are all over the place. And that's a lot of those people's minds you're not going to change. Their children's minds you may, and their grandchildren's minds you may. So some of it is we're losing our country. I don't like these things that are happening on college campuses. Well, that's going to happen. But the economic issues, I mean, the things that the president did were terrible for rural communities. I mean, they were horrible. And there ought to be a way for Democrats to make that case. It gets to the what's the matter with Kansas problem that Tom Frank wrote about years ago. So, going forward, they'll have to figure out that message. And I think there was some success in doing that. I mean, obviously, they won back Wisconsin. So,
Democratic activists and just regular old Democrats around the country threw a lot of money into these races. Was it a waste of money? I know, Kevin, you and I have talked about this. Was it a waste of money? Does money like this not matter? Should the Georgia Senate races runoffs will be in January. Is it useful for Democrats to be throwing in tons of money there?
Look, money. So like John Ossoff came very close to beating David Perdue in Georgia, and did force the runoff. He also raised a lot of money and put it to good use. A lot of this is just how this money is being deployed and where it's being deployed. Look, and I think there's variables here. The one thing that we shouldn't forget is that Republicans spent a lot of money in these places too. Lindsey Graham was able to raise a lot. Senate Leadership Fund, which is a super PAC controlled by Mitch McConnell, would raise tens of millions of dollars from Sheldon Adelson and his wife alone. Never mind, I believe they also got tens of millions of dollars from a few other donors as well. They spent a lot of money there offsetting what Democratic, mostly grassroots money was able to do. So look, money matters in politics. However, I think we do need to realize that there probably is at some point some limited returns to this. And that's been true for a while. The most important thing in politics is having enough money to win, not having the most money. I think we could see that, if we go back to the primaries, Michael Bloomberg was spending, like, at a certain point, you can't control narratives, you can't control who's already in the race in the territory you're fighting in. And look, I think there's other ways that money could be put to better use. I think you're already seeing some people talk about, well, Democrats maybe need to do more long-term building in some of these places. And Sharice earlier mentioned the progressive activists in Arizona. I think that's also true in Georgia. Those are two places where Democrats and progressive groups have spent a long time building up these groups to help flip these states. And I think you could maybe contrast that with Florida, where I think at times some of that outreach has been more hit and miss over time. So I think it's a really good question. It does not have a simple answer because there's also been times where Democrats have done a lot of organizing and then fallen short. This every year is different. These coalitions are shifting all the time. When Trump is no longer on the ballot, these parties are going to shift again. It could just be that maybe Democrats win the suburbs a little bit less and pick up some ground in rural areas. It could be that, heck, maybe somehow Republicans gain even more with Hispanic voters. There's a lot of possibilities for how these parties are going to shift. And so it's very difficult to say this is the best way to use your money. Democrats have good ideas on that, but I think they need to go back to the drawing board and solve this.
Yeah, these Georgia runoffs are going to be fascinating because Trump will not be on the ballot. And so the segment of the Republican Party that is Trump-centric, they think that what I like to call the Trump cult part of the Republican Party. I don't know how big that is. I don't know if that's 5%, 10%, 15%, but I see very little interest on those people's part in Georgia to come out and vote for these two people that, they're not Donald Trump. Why should I even care? Democrats generally don't do a great job in specials, or in runoffs. So we'll see how that works. But on the other hand, Stacey Abrams and her group have done a phenomenal job in organizing, getting people registered, and actually getting them out to vote. That's different from just getting them registered. This is going to be really interesting. As to money, if politically savvy people appreciate the importance of the Senate, I think, though, a lot of voters voted Tuesday because, by God, Donald Trump is the best thing on this planet ever, and I have to support him. And others said, he is a threat to the entire planet. I have to vote against him. Both of those are gone. So let's see now what the base feeling is among people who are interested in politics but are not crazy interested in politics.
And I think an interesting thing to watch here will be Mitch McConnell is not a popular figure. He's not popular anywhere in America.
Right.
Even in Kentucky, where he won 56% of the vote, he's not really that popular. They just really don't like Democrats. So I think it'll be interesting to see if Democrats are able to use the specter of Mitch McConnell blocking everything and causing gridlock again. And this will just be as bad as the Obama years, where all anyone did was squabble and nothing got done. If they're going to be able to somehow use that message to boost Ossoff and Warnock, I think that'll be really interesting. But like, as you said, Republicans traditionally have done very well in these runoff elections. Whether that shifts a little because of who the party's bases are now, white college educated voters are the most reliable voters. And those people have shifted towards Democrats. So that might blunt the Republican advantage there. But look, Republicans go into those two runoffs as pretty clear favorites, but not overwhelming ones.
Yeah.
So the poll that you guys took, who will control the Senate in 2021 after the Georgia runoffs, 62% of you said Republicans and 38% of you said Democrats. So I wanted to pull up the last poll. And this one is about Trump leaving office if he loses. Do you think Trump will refuse to leave the White House if Biden wins? So, Sharice, I know you have been looking at this. Let's say that Trump does end up losing. What what is this lame duck period going to look like? What's Trump going to be doing?
Actually, I have a story that I've reported out that's ready to go as soon as we're certain this is going to happen. But I've been amused by this undercurrent in like very online progressivism that Donald Trump will just never leave. He'll just stay there, and the army will help him. And no, there'll be an oath of office that's administered at noon on the 20th of January. It'll be given by the Chief Justice of the United States. And the dude with the nuclear football will be there and will then attach himself to the new president. That's that. If he chooses not to leave the White House proper, well, he's a trespasser. They'll change the locks on him and, shake him down and get all the flatware and stuff that he may have taken, and then escort him out. This is ridiculous. Of course he's going to leave. Whether he does it next week and go to Mar-a-Lago and never come back, that's my best guess, actually, is, he'd prefer to be down there anyway with this very iffy weather for playing golf now up here. Yeah, he's going to leave and it'll be pouty and so forth. But, come on. He's not Superman. I mean, whether he thinks he is or he isn't, of course he has to leave the White House. And it really doesn't matter. The new president can be the president from Wilmington if, the current president throws a tantrum and makes a mess and destroys the place. I don't know, but yeah, he's going to leave. That's, yeah.
Okay, so we will have the results of that in a second, but I want to turn to questions because I assume that you all have a lot. And if you don't, I have plenty of other questions. So we'll go to those. Is the poll ready or not quite yet? Yes, the poll is ready. So 62% of you disagree with Sharish and think Trump will refuse to leave the White House if Biden wins. And 38% of you agree with Sharish. So, okay, so I will throw it over to Hillary now, who will get some audience questions.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, guys. So just a reminder, if you've got a question, click participants and raise hand. I see we already have a couple, which is great. I will unmute you and ask you to share your question and where you're from, and we will try to get to as many folks as we can. So let's get started. I know that Susan Crawford has had her hand up for a while. So Susan, I'm going to ask to unmute you now. There you go. Go ahead and ask your question and tell us where you're from.
Thank you. I'm from New York City, and I also happen to be on the steering committee of our local Democratic club, so I'm very keyed into a lot of these issues. And one thing I've been following closely is about the voting machine fraud that goes on, and that's been covered by Greg Palast for years. And I sent you a thread as part of my question yesterday, which you can all look at from Twitter, just talking about what was going on Tuesday with excessive numbers of votes from South Florida, switching of names on machines in other states. And I just wonder if any of you have covered any of this, what you think of it. I saw the man on the screen roll his eyes a little when I said Greg Palast's name. So, I just see it almost covered, not at all in the mainstream media. And I'd like you to address it because a lot of us are very upset about it.
Well, I was in Florida for 2000, right? When we had like 3 or 4 different types of voting systems in the state. And the problem was bad equipment and bad user error, actually, in several counties that led to what happened. So in 2001, the Florida legislature mandated that you could only use certain types of machines. And then a lot of counties moved to the electronic ones where you touch the screen and enter your vote that way. And it became very obvious very quickly that this was hackable and there was no physical record whatsoever. So I believe when Charlie Crist was governor in 2007, they passed another law that said, okay, well, now you have to use a particular type of voting machine, and it's the one where you fill out the little bubbles on a piece of paper, and that's your vote. And okay, so you may be able to hack vote totals in the machine at the precinct, but you can't hack the vote itself. There's a physical paper record of this, which you can count by hand. So, and that has become, by the way, the most common voting system in the country. I just don't see that as a major concern. I mean, I would be much more worried if there are places that still rely on, and I think there are a few states that still rely on what they call the DRE equipment, the direct recording. I think a better issue for Democrats would be, what did we do wrong that so many Cuban Americans who actually voted for President Obama in 2012, right? I believe he actually won the Cuban American vote. He sure won Hispanics big statewide. That's a bigger thing. Why is it that this really insane appeal to accusing Joe Biden, of all people, of being a crazy socialist who would make Florida look like Venezuela? How did that work, and what could have been done to prevent that? Because honestly, I mean, people, my colleagues at other news outlets were reporting on that, who live in Florida and continue to work in Florida for months, and they were right. And I've been in touch with some Democratic activists and Latino activists who said, this is worrisome. We're losing these folks and we don't know how to get them back in time.
Look, I may have been the person who rolled my eyes at the mention of Greg Palast. He has frequently made really claims that just in the end don't have much evidence. Most recently in 2020, he claimed that the Democratic primary in California was being stolen from Bernie Sanders, simply because independent voters had to fill out an additional form to vote in the Democratic primary there, in a change that had been widely announced. And, for months, people knew about this. He frequently has made allegations that just in the end don't add up, either according to the local reporters who cover these states. This goes back to, the last decade in Colorado. He made some allegations about voters being purged en masse from the Colorado voter rolls that the journalists in those states looked into and didn't back up. He has done some good work on voter purges in Georgia in the past, but he's also just made a lot of claims that in the end haven't added up. And that's why, I think you see a lot of mainstream media outlets ignoring his work. People have limited amounts of credibility, and I think he's a figure who has lost some in the eyes of a lot of other reporters, particularly ones who cover election administration issues really, really closely, frequently warn people about listening to him too much. So look, we can all look into some of the things he might be raising, and maybe some of these issues are legitimate, but he does not have a ton of credibility at this point in time.
Thank you, guys. We'll go next to Karen Heaton. Karen, I'm going to ask to unmute you. There you go. Please tell us where you're from.
Hi, I am from Tennessee, the South, and my question is, how come, abortion is always the issue here in every election, and the evangelicals always say they have to vote for a Republican no matter what because of the abortion issue. But it is my understanding that the Supreme Court made the decision in 1974 and that a president cannot overturn it. Is that correct? Because if it is, then people who vote on this one issue for that one reason, they're just sort of wasting their vote. Congress or the president cannot overturn Roe versus Wade. So if they can't do anything about abortion, why are they voting on the one issue? And why is this not put out there for everybody to be educated so they would know that?
Well, I think I can touch on this a little bit. I wrote a book recently about Trump, and one of the things I did look into, because I didn't know this at the time, was why the white evangelical community has been Republican, solidly Republican for the last 50 years. And I thought that it was about abortion. And as I researched this, no, it's not. It was actually about segregated schools and the right to have segregated schools with public funding. So it was not really Roe v. Wade, but it was the IRS decision to take away the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University, which enraged a lot of the white evangelicals in the South. And that's what this is really about. So it's not, I mean, abortion became a convenient thing. And in fact, a lot of the Republican Party activists at the time sold evangelical voters and the Christian academies that were basically just segregated schools created for the purpose of keeping their children away from Black children, right after Brown v. Board in 1954. The Republican activists in that time persuaded them to look, this is a loser issue, all right? I mean, you can't go with a straight face and say, I support segregated schools and therefore I'm gonna vote for X, Y, or Z. But abortion is. You can have a moral argument about abortion, which you can't have about racism, basically. And this is where the Republican Party kind of co-opted abortion to use to draw a lot of voters in the South who are drifting away from the Democratic Party anyway because of Lyndon Johnson's Civil Rights Act. So, you know, it's a complicated issue, but you're right. No Congress can overturn Roe v. Wade, which basically found a constitutional right to an abortion for at least the first trimester and then some regulations after that. And a president can really do nothing other than appoint Supreme Court justices. And Donald Trump really didn't even do that. He kind of outsourced that entire thing to the Federalist Society and Mitch McConnell. So, you know, there's a whole lot of things bundled up in there with where the white evangelical community is. And I say the white evangelicals because other evangelical voters are not like this. They don't vote the way white evangelical voters do.
Thank you, Shirish. Next, I will ask Jackie Anderson to share her question.
Hi, everybody. I'm from Colorado, where unfortunately, a woman who is a supporter of QAnon has been elected to the United States House of Representatives. And that's quite scary. But my question is for the media, for you guys. Do you regret the incredible amount of publicity you gave to Trump as a candidate, where every stupidity that he uttered reinforced in people's minds, oh, I like him because he tells it like it is? And are you going to change somehow when the next Trump comes along?
Well, at HuffPost, I believe there was an editorial decision which was made before I even joined HuffPost that Donald Trump would be treated on the editorial, the entertainment pages, and because that's what he was really about. He was trying to use this as a publicity stunt, which I believe is correct. He had no intention of winning the White House. He had no intention of being president. He had no intention of doing actual work because he doesn't like doing that. So a series of things happened, but you're right. He was given a lot of airtime, honestly, way more on cable television than any print media. I mean, I don't think those who write for a living had much to do with this. But he was put on the air because he's entertaining and he was great for ratings. And so you had like cable stations just showing an empty stage of where Donald Trump at some point would appear, rather than showing Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or John Kasich, et cetera, because those guys were gonna, you know, Jeb would come in with his 6-point plan for this and X, Y, and Z, and Marco Rubio would have his life story for the millionth time. And meanwhile, Donald Trump would insult everyone and be like Rodney Dangerfield for an hour, and that was better for TV, particularly in those slow months of late 2015 when people weren't watching. Now, I personally was appalled when I was still at National Journal and we were having story meetings, and some of the reporters were like, "Oh wow, Trump is just he's a fighter, he's a counterpuncher." And what nonsense is this? The man was lying all the time. Maybe that ought to be the focus, that he knows nothing about policy rather than how well he can insult people on the stage. And at that part, I do think the media has kind of learned its lesson. I mean, I think we saw that in the last few days when the president got up there and just lied about everything having to do with the election. And guess what? The New York Times called him a liar on the front page. This would have been unheard of, going back. I don't think they even did that during Richard Nixon's time. So yeah, when someone is abusive of the trust that we place in the political system, as Donald Trump has, it took us a while, but I think we collectively, the entire news media, including cable, have responded. And I think this is a lesson learned, hopefully going forward, that the next charlatan who comes along will be a little bit more aggressive in treating as a potential threat to democracy rather than as a good way to fill the next hour and a half on TV.
Yeah, I think the media has grown up a lot around Trump. He's forced the media to drastically stop both sidesing everything in a way that I think the media was already sort of starting to move away from before that. But Trump's sheer scale of lying just meant at a certain point that you had to constantly fact check him. And particularly the amount of times that Trump just lies about something that's like directly in front of your face. So look, I think the media will do a better job. And really, when this was most valuable to Trump, the attention was during the Republican primary, where he was just blotted out the sun of the other candidates who couldn't get any attention. Since then, I mean, I think having the attention on him all the time can often hurt him as much as it helps him, because he often, like we said, says things that don't make any sense and just kind of makes a fool of himself sometimes. So look, I think if another one comes around, I think the media will handle it a lot better. And I would also be very skeptical that there can ever be another figure who's exactly like Trump in a lot of ways. So.
Great, thank you. Amanda, did you have anything to add to that? Or should I go to the next question? Next one, okay. Next, Eddie Walker. I will be asking to unmute you. There you go, you're on.
Okay, so I assume you're hearing me? No? Okay. I am a president of a union local representing 1,500 federal employees in Austin, Texas. So what you might give me some insight on is, why does Congress not investigate a high-profile investigation of Elaine Chao under the grounds that she used her position, I've got this written down, to advance her business interests in China, which benefited her husband financially, and also her actions funneling government spending to Kentucky, which also benefited her husband's political interests. Why would we not focus attention on that? I mean, I'm not saying we should be like Republicans who have a lot of, investigations that are based on nothing, but it would be good to investigate things that are real and let the chips fall where they may. Any insight into why that's not being done?
I think there's probably a few reasons. Let's just start with, so the people who would be doing that would presumably be House Democrats. That would effectively declare war on Mitch McConnell in a way that my guess Nancy Pelosi thinks would be counterproductive to getting other things done. Whether you think Democrats should go ahead and do that anyway, that might be the case. But I would also broadly say that House Democrats really did drop the ball on a lot of oversight over these past 2 years. They didn't pursue a lot of it. At times, they, particularly after impeachment, they almost seemed scared to do it because they were afraid, like, what if we uncover another impeachable offense? We have to impeach him again. We'll look ridiculous. So there was a lot of slow walking of these things that really House Democrats had run on promising that they would do. House Democrats didn't get Trump's tax returns. The media did. House Democrats didn't uncover the way Trump uses his business interests to potentially take money from foreign governments. The media did. The media has really led the way in investigating Trump at a time when House Democrats have dropped the ball. And I think that applies to his administration as well. What we know about what Elaine Chao did has mostly, I believe, come from media reports, some of which may have cited some things House Democrats uncovered. But a lot of it was either media reports or just other Democratic outside groups monitoring these things, not from Congress itself. And it will be interesting to see in sort of the postmortems of this election whether or not people think that House Democrats should have been more aggressive in negotiating Chao or negotiating Betsy DeVos investigating Chao or Betsy DeVos or Trump or his response to the pandemic or any one of a whole number of other things, because they weren't all that aggressive at times. And it'll be interesting to see if, what blowback there might be from that.
And just to follow up, Shirish, you can respond to that, but also, what sort of trouble do you think Trump will be in, in terms of investigations and all that after he's out of office?
Right. Yeah, I think no holds barred now, because the more, and frankly, it'll probably be good for the country. The more you investigate Donald Trump and get the stuff that he did out in the open, it'll help the Republican Party clean up its own act. It cannot allow someone like Trump to get the nomination again. And it failed us when it allowed it to happen in the first time. Now, as to why not investigate Elaine Chao more, well, what you described is kind of at the high end of what corruption used to be, right? A conflict of interest, maybe some self-dealing. And it used to be that if the brother-in-law of the friend was benefiting, that was something that was, oh, this is going to create a scandal for a week. Well, here we have, if you want something from the Trump administration, if you want a rule change that allows you to do mining here versus where you can't do it now, you can't give $100,000 in cash to the president. That's a bribe and illegal. But you can go to the Trump Hotel and book 10 rooms and stay there for a month, and that is totally legal under what we've allowed, which is just open, flat, brazen corruption, which is ridiculous. And that is where I think, to their credit, there were some emoluments lawsuits, which is, by the way, illegal under the Constitution, let alone under the corruption laws. What Kevin said, I don't think we're going to have someone like that again. And unless he runs again in 2024, which I'm not ruling out. But, Donald Trump faces some issues now for previous actions before he became president in terms of bank fraud, tax fraud. I don't think the statute of limitations have run out. The city of New York district attorney is also investigating him. And then there's the stuff he did while in office. He did obstruction of justice, he did extortion, and the clock is still running on those. So this will be a good thing to air all this out, because this has been happening in plain sight. He's the most openly corrupt president in more than 100 years. I mean, remember, Teapot Dome was about a cabinet officer, not about the president himself taking money. I mean, we forget that this has been appalling what's happened. And Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans, with the exception of Mitt Romney, say, well, that's cool. We're fine with this. So there needs to be a reckoning and go back to where the stuff that our State Department would be haranguing another country if it saw should not be allowed here. It's pretty simple.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we can get to a couple more questions. Next will be from Susan Sherwin. Susan, I will unmute you.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. We've all been so concerned about the polling, and in light of 2016, I think most of us are still pretty afraid until the fat lady sings. I live in Southwest Florida, between Naples and Fort Myers, very Republican area. And not only my Republican friends, but people don't answer the phone, as you mentioned. And part of that is because it will say unknown caller. Would it be more helpful if the name on the phone could say, Democratic Party or something indicating who it is? Could that possibly be done to increase responses, in polling?
Potentially. I mean, the unknown number problem, I've heard pollsters specifically talk about exactly what you're describing. People just don't pick up anything from a number they don't know because they assume it's going to be like some weird spam. And often it is weird spam. As reporters, we sort of have to always pick up the phone. So we're very much outliers in this because you never know who's calling. But yeah, I think there are ways that could be done. And look, there's other things, there's other methods that are still being tested, and maybe some of them will get through. You've seen this year, there's been more sort of, what they'll do is instead they'll text people a link to a website, and then on the website you fill out the poll. Some people have had it looks like some more success with that. We'll have to compare everything to the final results once the final results are in. That's one method that's come up more. We at HuffPost, for our own polling, use sort of an online panel. We don't do election polling though, which removes some of the complications because we don't need to figure out, who's actually voting. We can just get a representative sample of the country, which is a more set thing based on census data. So these are all different options. But no, I think what you're saying is actually a problem. One thing that I think could work is, sometimes with these polls, if you answer them, you get put in a lottery to get like a $20 Amazon gift card or whatever. If you could say like $20 Amazon gift card, maybe people would pick up the phone. But yeah, that could be a potential solution. This has been a long developing problem. As it used to be that when pollsters would call out, they would get 20 or 30% response rates is what they call. It's now down to around 3%. And that's been steadily dropping for a long time. So we'll see. Pollsters are going to need to find a way to figure this out, or maybe just start finding other ways to adjust.
Thanks, Kevin. I think my cat really likes your voice because every time you talk, he jumps into my lap. Sorry, Sharish. Okay, Sally Fortin Francis, I am going to ask to unmute you and tell us where you're from and your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep, I'm from the state of Maine, originally from the state of Massachusetts. And for the first time, I did phone calls for the Seacoast Dems. I'm from a pretty democratic York County, Maine. And I also went door to door. And one thing that I'm kind of worried about is I don't know if the Democratic Party is doing enough to register new voters to the Democratic Party. I'm afraid that the Republicans I've seen polls, and again, we're talking polls, I don't know if they're right, but I just would like to see more, not just going after the voters that, are going to vote Democratic, but some of the outreach to be more to engage young people and get them to register Democratic. I think there's a lean towards registering independent, and I'd like to get back to what the party is. And I've been a Democrat since I'm 18 and I'm 60 now. So I don't know if anybody wants to address that.
So yeah, particularly voter registration, particularly, in Maine, is an interesting one. It must have been last spring, and I don't know how these schools ended up handling this, but was talking to a Democrat in Maine who was worried that because of the pandemic, Colby, Bates, Bowdoin, UMaine, all of these schools, which actually have a significant number of people who come from out of state to go to them and are young and fairly democratic, if they were doing classes online, that might hurt Sarah Gideon or her Democratic chances to win the state at the presidential level. So I don't know how that ended up. But look, voter registration for Democrats, in part because Democrats stopped in most places. In Maine, it continued because the virus rates there were very low. But in most places, they didn't knock on doors as much over the summer. And you saw a big drop off in voter registration, which then picked back up after the George Floyd protests. There's charts where you can see a huge spike in young people registering after that. But it might not have been enough to make up for those earlier drop-offs. So I think that's a big problem for Democrats that I think is going to get relitigated. Whether or not Democrats should have been out on the doors earlier and more often. Republicans never stopped. That may have led to spreading the coronavirus, but it may have also helped them win elections. So I think that's going to be something that's litigated a lot. The Biden campaign for a very long time was insistent that basically what they were doing over the phones and via text messaging could be a good enough replacement for going on the doors. And then in the final weeks of the campaign, they announced this right before Trump announced he had coronavirus. So it sort of got buried, but they switched and decided to start going and doing some limited door-to-door work in a few states. I think there's going to be a lot of people questioning whether or not they should have made that decision earlier. But I think we sort of need to see, some of the data on where exactly they started doing it and how that might have affected Democratic performance there before we know 100% for sure.
Yeah, I can tell you in Florida that the Florida Democratic Party has been a disaster since Lawton Chiles was governor, and he really wasn't interested that much in the Florida Democratic Party because he never needed it. He was a legend and he could always win and didn't need it, and put in a crony who did a miserable job, and it's never really recovered. When Barack Obama won in 2008, he did it by basically building his own Democratic Party down there, and that kind of has remained. The people who work for him are the top Democratic operatives in the state, and when it's someone who can call on those guys, they do a decent job. But as Kevin said, I mean, like in South Florida particularly, I mean, the Republicans in Donald Trump's campaign were working the entire time from 2017 forward to make sure that those 29 votes were going to go his way. I didn't see that. I mean, but I know that the person who ended up running that campaign, Susie Wiles, was very talented, and every Republican statewide race in the last 10 years has tried to get her to be the campaign manager with good reason. She's very organized and gets it done, and she did.
Okay, let's squeeze in one last question. This will go to Richard Vandenbroel. I'm going to unmute you, or ask to unmute. There we go. Richard, do you have a question? Oh, it still says you're muted. Let me try one more time.
Okay. Well, in 1980, I was a precinct delegate in Michigan for Ronald Reagan, a Republican. That's 40 years ago. And now I'm a Democrat. When I got Medicare and Social Security, two socialist programs, by the way, I'm thrilled. And but it occurred to me, since 1980, the Republicans essentially have had a platform that never changed, okay? Take over the Supreme Court, take over the state houses, keep the Senate, lower taxes, and maybe make guns more readily available. But the Democrats, what is their platform? Okay, when I moved to Michigan in 1977, the unions were solid here. Oh, that's the other thing. Republicans in the 80s decided we're going to go after the unions, and they did. So there was no solidarity, by the way, with public employee unions. As my friends in California, where I have a condo in Sonoma, they all bought foreign cars, even though they were in the federal unions, right? Mm-hmm. My point is, I'm kind of, the Democratic platform, it's like, it seems to like, oh yeah, we're for gays, yeah, and we're for women, right? And blacks, but really, what is the goal? In business, you have goals. All my life, we had goals, okay? Simple three or four things, but you stuck with the same thing. And so the messaging from the Democratic Party, really, what is it? Other than we're against the Republicans. Mm-hmm. Anyway, maybe you can help me out on this.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a real problem. Democrats, I think this year, particularly down ballot, ran very much on protecting the Affordable Care Act, which I think was a very good message. Republicans were trying to overrepeal the Affordable Care Act. That, by all accounts, including Republican accounts, is very unpopular at this point. People like the pre-existing condition protections. People generally like Medicaid expansion. But they didn't necessarily have what are you going to do next? Biden did have plans for sort of, here's my economic plan to help recover from the coronavirus pandemic. But those plans didn't make it out into the mainstream and weren't quickly summarized the way like Build the Wall was, for instance, for Trump. So I think you're going to see a lot of questioning of that, of whether they needed a better core economic message. That could have been, like, part of Biden's plan was sending everyone another $1,200 check, like everyone got, or not everyone, but a lot of people got in the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic. Should he have talked more about that? Another thing that I think is going to get litigated a lot is, should he have emphasized raising the minimum wage more? Raising the minimum wage is an incredibly popular policy. In Florida, it passed with, Sharish, you can check me on this, I believe it was over 60% of the vote.
Yeah, it's law.
And in Florida, the top Democrat in the state is the agriculture commissioner. She didn't endorse it until only a few days before the election. Why Democrats wouldn't immediately attach themselves to this and say, you know, where are the people who want to raise the minimum wage, was baffling, particularly because it's something that every elected Democrat supports, at least in theory. But at the same time, embracing some of those issues in the past hasn't always helped candidates that much. Claire McCaskill really embraced that in Missouri, but, you know, the minimum wage increase passed and she still lost in 2018. So this isn't, there's no easy solutions here, but I definitely think the lack of a focused economic message is going to be something a lot of Democrats are talking about after, starting, the second the Biden race is called the presidential. So we'll see.
Right. On that point, a couple of things. One is, I think Democrats believe, and I think they're right, that generally over the long run, the country is moving in their direction, right? We have the Affordable Care Act. We didn't used to. More and more vulnerable minorities are getting more and more protections, and they're getting more and more accepted in society. So generally, things are headed in the right way. As long as climate change is dealt with, and et cetera, we can, have a decent future. Republicans are not like that. Their entire base is diminishing because they built it around white grievance politics. They like to accuse Democrats of doing identity politics, but that's kind of what they've done since 1968 and actually since 1954. So in a sense, they're the ones who needed the gimmicks. Here, we'll give you a tax cut. Here's $50, vote for us, that sort of stuff. And that's something the Democrats haven't really needed as much. In this particular election, I think what was Joe Biden's main issue? Number one issue, I am not Donald Trump. I am not insane. I'm not gonna wreck the planet. And for most Democrats and most Americans, frankly, that was enough. We're tired of the mess. We're tired of the chaos. We're tired of the noise. We're just exhausted. Please let me sleep and not have to check my phone at 5:30 in the morning. And I think that was good enough for now. And we can regroup after this.
Okay, well, we're just over time. So I'm going to wrap up. First, I want to thank Amanda, Kevin, and Sharish for answering all these questions, and for everybody who attended today and shared their questions. We really appreciate it. Stick around for one more minute. I've got a couple more things to say. First, we know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but you can still share your question with us through our election forums. Lizelle will put a link in the chat. So if you're interested in sharing your questions, we still want to hear them. So please share them in one of these forums and look for that link in the chat. Also, wanted to thank you again for signing up for HuffPost membership. You get access to events like these. And I just wanted to let you know about 2 more events we're having next week. We're having an event on the intersection of race and COVID-19 with our medical contributor, Dr. Kavita Patel. And on Thursday, that's on Thursday. And our food editor, Kristen Aiken, will be answering your Thanksgiving questions in a commenting forum starting on Wednesday. So we've got Wednesday, Thanksgiving, Thursday, COVID-19 and race, very different, but both really interesting and really important. And we hope we'll see you in one of those. And hopefully we'll get this group together again. There's still going to be a lot more to talk about. And thank you all again for coming today, and to all of you who have been joining us over the last couple of weeks for these. It's been great to see familiar faces and hear all your questions. So take care and good luck surviving the rest of today and tomorrow and however long this goes. And see you soon. Thank you.
Okay.